In the year 1895, a quiet Irish parish holds its breath as swirling peat smoke irons the air and a whisper travels through thatch and wattle, a rumor that something has shifted beneath the skin of ordinary life. Picture a hearth lit with stubborn resolve, a man's hands tighten around a truth he cannot bear to face, and a house where the clock ticks like a fault line beneath the floorboards. The night presses in, and the world beyond the door forgets the danger of superstition. Yet the shadows remember every name, every hesitation, every scream that might have been silenced. From the frost-wrapped fields to the fevered glare of a courtroom, the story gathers its own gravity, as if the very air conspires to weigh down the truth with the tremor of fear. Imagine the courtroom as a cathedral of accusation, where witnesses become relics and every syllable rings with the salt of memory, while a society clings to old spells and new laws with equal ferocity. The smoke of the peat, the scent of coal and damp wool, the careful ink on brittle pages, these become the gears of a machinery of judgment that seeks to illuminate the darkest corners of belief. And so a line is drawn between myth and consequence, between the quiet pain of a life misread and the brutal act born from that misread, a hinge moment where culture and law collide in a blaze of testimony and consequence. The tale we stand at the threshold of is not merely a history lesson, but a reckoning with how fear masquerades as truth, how a community's fear can burn brighter than mercy, and how the cold flame of judgment can reveal the humanity that fear often consumes. Picture this: a frost-laden dawn on a quiet Irish lane, the thatch still glistening with ice and the peat-smoked air curling along the cobbles. You stand at the threshold of a parish where the ordinary hum of daily life suddenly trembles as a rumor threads its way through cold windows and closed doors, whispering of a missing woman and a house that holds its breath. A clock ticks with a hollow confidence, as if counting down to a reckoning that no one yet dares name. And the breath of the village fogs the glass with frost-bitten syllables that feel like marks left by unseen hands. Beyond the hedgerows, fields lie pale under a winter sun that seems reluctant to rise, and every fence becomes a boundary between safety and the unknown. The air carries the scent of peat and rain, a chemical memory of lingering storms and old superstitions that refuse to fade. In this moment, you sense the weight of what the village is about to confront. A fracture in the visible world. A crack where belief leaks through and drags the present toward a past saturated with magic, fear, and consequence. The people you meet carry their lives like coats buttoned tight against the cold. Yet their eyes reveal a tremor, a question that gnaws at the edge of polite talk. What price does a community pay when it decides that the ordinary is a lie and the miraculous is a threat? We begin where rumor takes root. A missing woman named Bridget, a name spoken aloud in the same breath as concerns about health, faith, and the fragile boundary between human and other. The village speaks in parables and practicalities alike, balancing the warmth of family kitchens with the chill of superstition that travels faster than any horse-drawn cart. In the cottages, children press noses to windows as if to catch a glimpse of the unseen, while elders recount tales of fairy folk and replaced souls with a cadence that has the ring of confirmation, not caution. You hear the click of a lock, the hush of a door that will not be opened, and you feel the collective heartbeat of a community poised on the cusp of tragedy and revelation. In this frost-silvered liminality, we observe Bridget not as a silent figure in a case file, but as a person whose life has become a hinge upon which a culture swings between mercy and suspicion. Her absence is not merely a missing person report. It is a fracture that invites examination of what a society fears most: the loss of sovereignty over the body's truth, the suspicion that illness might be transfigured into proof of possession or deception. The handwriting of the local doctor, the lines etched by magistrates, the whispers of neighbors, all of these become stones in a mosaic that points toward a verdict not only about one woman, but about a world that still interprets suffering through the lens of myth. The mood is heavy, with a palette of greens and grays, the color of fields after rain, the color of ink on ledger sheets, the color of a night that does not forget. As the day edges into afternoon, a pattern emerges. Signs of a life interrupted. A routine disrupted by an alarm that arrives with the certainty of a storm. Bridget's absence becomes a specter in the room, a presence that makes the familiar feel suddenly dangerous. People speak of a husband's sternness and a wife's gentle resilience in the same breath, as if the boundary between tenderness and coercion were a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. We watch the small rituals of everyday life, the lighting of the hearth, the grinding of corn, the careful tidying of a room, refracted through the lens of fear. In this awakening, the village is not merely a stage, but a living archive, storing memories of a time when the lines between cure and curse, healer and enchanter, healer and harm, stood as thin as a blade's edge. The narrative folds inward here, inviting you to inhabit the scene with restraint and listening, to feel the cold that makes breath visible, and to sense the slow, inexorable drift toward a drama that will redefine what a community believes about truth, body, and the souls that dwell inside them. In the margins of this dawn, you begin to sense the architecture of the coming conflict. A society seeking to protect a vulnerable life, while simultaneously policing the boundaries of the magical and the mundane. The clock on the church tower ticks with a stubborn tempo, a reminder that time itself will arbitrate the questions we are only just beginning to formulate. The road outside the parish gate narrows into tracks that vanish into a horizon of frost. Each footstep along that road echoes with the possibility that the ordinary can become extraordinary, and that an ordinary life can be torn, burned, and bound to a narrative that will outlive its owner. And so, we stand at the threshold of a story that will test the endurance of a culture's belief in the miraculous, the integrity of a life lived under constant watch, and the stubborn, almost cruel insistence that the truth must be shaped by the fearsome grammar of the times. This is not merely history. It is a clarion call to observe how the flame of superstition can burn through the quietest human vocabulary and leave a scorch on memory that endures far beyond the ashes. The room holds its breath as documents spill onto a table like small, exact funerals of certainty, and the air tilts with the gravity of witnesses who carry memories heavy as iron. A door creaks open, admitting a chorus of voices that will push the case toward a verdict the village will not forget. And the scene expands from a parlor to a chamber where law, lore, and longing collide with a storm of questions. The atmosphere is thick with the scent of ink, wine, and old wool. Each scent a clue about the world Bridget Cleary inhabited and the one she became entangled with in the eyes of those who believed they were protecting her from harm. The narrative threads weave through the room, tracing the path from rumor to record, from suspicion to charge, from a single life to a culture's understanding of danger and deviation. We enter the record as if stepping into a cathedral of judgment where lamps burn with pale fire light, and every witness sketches their truth with the tremor of a hand that fears the consequence of truth misread. The doctors speak in careful phrases about symptoms and spirits, about the body as a map that might lie or reveal. The magistrates listen with a rigor that feels both modern and archaic, a reminder that the law in this place must reconcile the lived reality of fear with the demand for humane treatment. Yet beneath the procedural cadence, the village pulses with the same old recipe. A sickness becomes a sign becomes a discordant voice. And that voice must be answered by the weight of evidence and the weight of collective conscience. The courtroom becomes a stage where the audience includes the dead and the living, where every gesture is a testament and every silence a possible confession of guilt or mercy. Across the room, Bridget's partner and the family that stood by him carry their own gravity, their faces etched with a mix of denial, hurt, and a stubborn belief in what they fear most. The pages of testimony flutter under the lamp, as if the truth itself were a fragile creature that could be startled into flight by a careless question or a too hasty assumption. You can hear the cadence of the Irish courtroom speak, the careful repetition of facts, the tentative pivot toward interpretation, the insistence on due process, even as the crowd interprets every sign through a lens of myth. The witnesses speak of pain and prolongation, of a voice that changed and a body that endured a torment born of belief rather than simply hunger or fatigue. The moral weight of the moment rests not on one act alone, but on the chorus of beliefs that made a single act intelligible, even necessary, within a structure of fear and reverence for the unseen forces that govern life and death. The narrative moves with a patient, almost cinematic tempo, shifting from the sterile glow of the courtroom to the intimate warmth of kitchen tables where mothers rock their children and neighbors share quiet prayers for safety. In those interludes, the observer sees how superstition survives by adapting to the rational world, how the lore of fairies and the dread of spirits find a foothold in the clean lines of modern procedure. There is a tension between compassion and control, a tension that pins the heart to the thought that a life might be saved or reclaimed through the right words, rituals, or declarations. The text of the case, dates, names, times, becomes less a dossier than a map that reveals how deeply culture etches itself into the pathogen of fear. The period's language, rendered in solemn detail, carries the weight of centuries, reminding us that even in the waning glow of a modern courtroom, the ghosts of older laws and older beliefs still walk the aisles and linger in the margins. As the chapters of testimony close and the room exhales, a quiet clarity begins to emerge. The case is not merely about a controversial diagnosis or an alleged crime, but about the fragile autonomy of a woman within a community that fears change more than it fears harm. The question lingers like smoke in a hearth pit. How do we distinguish mercy from moral panic, healing from domination, truth from the need to control narratives about danger? The hallways outside the chamber echo with the steps of those who will carry the verdict into the world. And you sense that whatever judgment arrives will reverberate beyond Bridget's face and name, shaping how people speak about illness, agency, and the boundaries of belief, in a time when superstition clung to the edges of reason with a stubborn, almost affectionate grip. The chapter ends not with a conclusion, but with a hinge. An invitation to look again at the way fear textures a society, and at the way a single case can illuminate the long, unquiet conversation between myth and law, between mercy and the human need to name and tame the unknown. The courtroom's echo gives way to a slower, more intimate cadence as the trial recedes behind it, and the village memory takes center stage, gathering details like shells along a shoreline of recollection. A lantern's glow spills across a table, revealing careful notes and questions that linger in the air, as if the room itself were listening for a truth that has not yet learned to speak clearly. In the margins of the transcript, you glimpse the human texture, the fatigue in a witness's shoulders, the tremor in a clerk's hand, the soft sorrow of a neighbor who cannot forget the sound of a door slamming in fear. These details become the scaffolding of a larger inquiry. How does a life become a symbol? How does fear become a method? And how does a society decide which parts of a person to protect and which to condemn? The narrative shifts to the memory of Bridget herself, not as a case file, but as a person who inhabited a world where weathered beliefs and changing laws intertwined. We glimpse early scenes of domestic life, a kitchen window fogged by breath and steam, a child's laughter that cuts through other sounds, the quiet rhythm of work and care that sustains a family. Through these vignettes, the story anchors Bridget in ordinary acts of tending to a home and to a spouse, even as those acts become entangled with fear and misinterpretation. The tension between tenderness and control unfurls like a braid, each strand tracing lineage back to old stories of changelings and spirits that could modify the living body with impunity. The effect is to widen the lens from a single moment of violence to a cultural weather that molds perception, just as a mold shapes a piece of clay. As the public memory grows sharper, so too does the examination of language, of the phrases that frame illness, danger, and truth. The medical terms are parsed with care, yet beneath every clinical term lingers a question about agency. Who truly speaks on Bridget's behalf when the community speaks in her name? The defense and the prosecution illuminate competing visions of care. One that seeks to heal through empathy and restraint, another that interprets distress through the filter of magical causation and social order. In this debate, the archive becomes a living room where elders recite legends while younger observers try to translate them into contemporary language. A struggle to reconcile two epistemologies that claim equal legitimacy in the same breath. The atmosphere remains charged with the paradox that violence can be enacted in the name of protection, and protection can feel like violence when directed at the wrong target. The air lingers with the scent of burnt memory, a hazy remnant of the judgment that reverberates through the village long after the gavel has fallen. Doors remain slightly ajar, as if listening for voices that might drift back from the echo chamber of the courtroom. And every room bears the imprint of conversations that stumbled over fear and duty. The town awakens to a different rhythm, a cadence that acknowledges both the fragility of a life and the stubborn persistence of belief, a balance that patience and time must learn to measure anew. In the hush that settles on the lanes, Bridget's name continues to travel through conversations, not as the endpoint of a case, but as a touchstone for questions about agency, care, and the price of communal certainty. The aftermath unfolds as a quiet, inexorable procession through daily life. People resume routine tasks, but their steps carry a new gravity, as if each movement is a careful negotiation between memory and mercy. The hearths blaze with a restrained warmth, a deliberate act of sustenance to counter the chill that fear leaves in its wake. The school children return to chalk and slate, while elders gather in doorways to recall the day when the world seemed to tilt, when what was believed sacred became a trial of conscience for every neighbor. The town's records fill with follow-up inquiries, the sort of procedural pages that never glow with drama, but become the sober backbone of a society attempting to reconcile harm with humanity. The text on those pages, names, times, verdicts, reads like a ledger of consequences, a reminder that every decision leaves a trace that time refuses to erase. Within homes, conversations that once moved in tentative circles now turn toward reflection and repair. Families discuss how fear shaped choices, how the need to protect can overshadow the obligation to understand, and how a life can be safeguarded not by sealing it within walls, but by listening more deeply to its truth. In kitchens and schoolrooms, the language of care evolves. embracing questions about mental health and social pressure, about the danger of turning belief into judgment, and about the necessity of separating danger from the person who bears it. The community begins to chart a new map of responsibility, one that marks the lines where care ends and coercion begins, where superstition yields to law, and where mercy can still be found, even when certainty has claimed its due. Yet the memory of the trial remains a living archive, a structure of narrative that invites continual interrogation. The villagers revisit the testimonies, not to reopen the case, but to study the human labyrinth that led them there. How did fear become a compass, guiding decisions with a cartographer's precision? And how did the social imagination render a life both emblem and casualty? The chapters of memory unfold like pages of a diary, each entry a small confession of how they chose to see Bridget, how they chose to see themselves in the act of judging. In these reflections, the village discovers a harder truth, that ritual and ritualized fear do not vanish with a verdict. They endure, morphing into practices that shape how future generations respond to distress, illness, and difference. The moral landscape shifts slowly, with tentative steps toward empathy, toward policies that protect without punishing, toward a language that names harm without sealing it in silence. The landscape outside remains a canvas of weathered stone and growing green. Moss climbs the walls where time has etched its quiet patience, and the fields beyond lie folded under a pale winter sun that promises renewal even as it recalls the past. In this season of remembrance, the community learns to measure progress not by dramatic shifts, but by small acts of reparation. A neighbor's steady presence, a teacher's patient explanation, a family's decision to seek help without shame. Bridget's case becomes a guidepost for a society that must learn to tolerate uncertainty while remaining loyal to the vulnerable, to the living, to the voices that insist on dignity. The tale ends not with a single verdict, but with an ongoing conversation about what it means to protect life while honoring its complexity. About how a culture can move from fear toward a steadier harbor of compassion. And about how judgment, once a moment of finality, can evolve into a long echo that informs every choice yet to come. In the waning light of a midwinter afternoon, the village gathers again, not for a trial, but for a quiet ceremony of memory that seeks to bind the past to the present with a looser, more forgiving thread. The air carries the faint tang of smoke and rain, and the sound of distant bells threads through the lanes like a lullaby that does not forget danger. People stand in small clusters outside the parish church, not to watch a verdict, but to acknowledge a shared history, to acknowledge that a life can endure in memory even when its body cannot withstand the weight of fear. The scene unfolds with a tenderness that feels almost unfamiliar after the sharp edges of chapters past. A deliberate attempt to translate shock into community care, and to convert a lingering suspicion into a vow to protect without retribution. The ceremony is simple, yet profound. Names spoken aloud, hands joined in quiet solidarity, and a circle of presence that refuses to let fear hollow the space where Bridget once lived. The act of remembrance becomes a form of medicine, a communal acknowledgement that healing requires listening more than blaming, compassion more than accusation. Children watch with wide eyes, absorbing the cadence of memory as if learning a new language, one that teaches them to speak of pain with care and to hear the tremor in a neighbor's voice without turning away. The adults offer stories not as proofs of fault, but as testimonies of endurance, a collection of small acts that kept a family steady during the long ache of rumor and rumor's consequences. As the memory rite unfolds, the narrative returns to the heart of the matter. What does it mean to honor life when memory itself is a weapon that can wound anew. The village confronts its own capacity for mercy, asking whether forgiveness can be more than a sentiment and whether accountability can coexist with another chance for the living to recover dignity. In the quiet conversations that follow, people reflect on how belief can illuminate and darken at the same time, how cultural memory can protect those in need while entangling them in the snares of fear. Some speak of reform, of better education about illness, of clearer boundaries between superstition and of systems that shield vulnerable individuals without imposing collective punishment. Others worry about the danger of forgetting, of letting the memory drift so far that its lessons become abstract and distant. The balance they seek is fragile, a line drawn with care, a vow to tend the living while honoring the dead and the stories that shaped them. In the domestic sphere, households ritualize healing as a practice rather than a moment. Neighbors leave windows open to invite daylight and air into rooms once sealed by suspicion, while families reach across aisles and fences to extend support to those who carry the weight of yesterday's fears. The language of care becomes more precise, more attentive to the realities of suffering, and more mindful of the dangers of stigmatizing illness or difference. The villagers learn to translate the old songs of charm and protection into contemporary commitments to mental health, safety, and the dignity of each person's autonomy. Bridget's memory becomes a touchstone for what a community owes to its most vulnerable members. Steadfast watchfulness, compassionate restraint, and a refusal to let fear define who deserves mercy. The narrative makes space for dialogues between generations. Debates that are less about blame and more about building a future where empathy guides action. The sound of distant bells and the soft murmur of rain on slate roofs accompany a turning point in the village's story. Now extended beyond Bridget Cleary's life into a broader project of reform and remembrance. The narrative invites us to observe how a community translates memory into policy, care, and a more nuanced understanding of vulnerability, illness, and truth. The streets hum with a patient energy as organizers, teachers, and family advocates begin to map a path forward, one that honors the past while deliberately shaping a safer present for those who might otherwise be silenced by fear. The atmosphere remains intimate, yet the scope widens to include dialogues between village groups, medical professionals, and local leaders who recognize that reform requires listening to voices historically marginalized by rumor and retribution. In classrooms and council chambers, conversations unfold about education, mental health resources, and the establishment of support networks for families facing distressing events. The mood blends determination with humility, acknowledging that transformation is a slow, imperfect process that must allow for trial and error. Across kitchen tables and church halls, communities practice new rituals of care, rituals that validate ambiguity and encourage seeking help without stigma. The memory of Bridget's case functions as both a warning and a catalyst, reminding everyone that fear can be a teacher only if its lessons are tempered by compassion, evidence, and an insistence on human dignity. The narrative threads weave together stories of patients who found relief through access to skilled professionals, of families who learned to navigate systems rather than shoulder the burden alone, and of neighbors who offered sustained companionship rather than quick judgments. A central motif emerges. Reform is not a single act, but a choreography, a sequence of policies, trainings, and cultural shifts that collectively reframe danger, care, and justice. The village begins to articulate criteria for distinguishing urgent protection from coercive control, to define boundaries between cultural tradition and universal rights, and to embed accountability into every stage of response. Public health education gains a foothold in local life. with sessions that demystify illness, explain signs of distress, and destigmatize conversations about fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. Storytelling workshops sprout in library corners, where elder recountings of the old beliefs are paired with contemporary explanations from doctors, social workers, and ethicists. The aim is to cultivate a shared language that honors the past, yet refuses to sanction harm in the name of protection or piety. The chapter's tone remains cautious, hopeful, and deliberately inclusive, recognizing that true reform invites dissent, debate, and the hard work of building trust across generations and social worlds. The landscape of memory evolves into a landscape of practice. Law and mercy no longer feel like opposed poles, but like complementary forces that, when balanced, protect the vulnerable while preserving the space for growth and learning. Community boards draft inclusive guidelines for responding to distress that emphasize early intervention, consent, and voluntary participation, ensuring that no one feels pressured into accepting interventions that undermine autonomy. Medical professionals collaborate with educators to design curricula that address the bodily and emotional dimensions of illness, while faith leaders participate as allies in safeguarding dignity rather than prescribing fear. The overarching message is that safety can coexist with openness, that resilience arises from a network of relationships built on trust rather than coercion, and that a community can emerge from tragedy with a strengthened ethical compass. Bridget's memory becomes a touchstone for this culture of reform, a reminder that the first duty of a society is to protect the living, while learning to understand the complexities of human vulnerability. As twilight gathers again, the village looks toward the future with a sense of purposeful quiet. The narrative leaves us within a space where policy, practice, and personal responsibility converge, inviting contemplation of how to sustain reform in a world where new fears can arise as old ones fade. The final scenes center on a circle of people of different ages and backgrounds, each bringing a lived experience that enriches the shared mission. They pledge to maintain brave conversations, to document lessons with honesty, and to keep the memory of Bridget alive, not as a weapon of indictment, but as a beacon guiding compassionate action. The chapter ends with a gentle invitation to continue listening, to reframe fear as a signal to act with care, and to view memory as a living archive that shapes every decision made in the name of community welfare. It is a testimony to progress that does not pretend perfection, but embraces accountability, learning, and the enduring vow to protect life with humanity, curiosity, and courage.